Order, we must move on. Just before I call the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Doncaster North, to put his urgent question and to hear the Minister's response, I hope on behalf of all colleagues across the House, to welcome Greta Thunberg, who's with us today, an enthusiastic and dedicated environmental campaigner. Colleagues, I, as Speaker, am very conscious that there are different views on these matters and different views on the matter of tactics in campaigning. But I think across the House we all believe in encouraging young people to stand up and speak up and say what they think and make their concerns known. So it was a pleasure for me, amongst other colleagues, to welcome Greta this morning. Greta, it was a pleasure to meet you, and I hope you enjoy listening to the exchanges. Urgent question, Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Minister to make a statement on climate action and Extinction Rebellion.
Thank you.
Minister of State Claire Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope I won't try the patience of the House, Mr. Speaker, because I will be making a further statement on this topic later this afternoon. But I do want to take the opportunity to join you in welcoming Ms Thunberg to the United Kingdom Parliament and her team. We tried very hard to meet personally, but despite the best efforts of our diaries, we couldn't do it. But I know she has met many, many members of the House of Commons and indeed my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the Environment, today. Mr. Speaker, I have to say that watching these protests over both here and globally over the last few days has raised slightly mixed emotions in me. On the one hand, there is excitement that the conversations that many of us were having 30 years ago about climate change are finally moving from niche to mainstream. And the question is not why act, but how fast can we act? Secondly, we understand completely the brilliant scientific evidence base, the motivation and the commitment that is driving people out right across the world to make their views known. But I worry, Mr. Speaker, that many of the messages we're hearing ignore the progress that is being made, and as such make people fearful for the future rather than hopeful. Here in the UK, thanks to excellent cross-party working, we were the first country in the world to pass a Climate Change Act. We have led the world in reducing the carbon intensity of our economy over the last 40 years. We've made huge progress on plastics-free activity. We have renewables last month contributing over 40% of our electricity supply. In fact, we've had our longest ever period of no coal contributing to the generation in the UK just this last weekend. And we have over 400,000 people now working in the low-carbon economy. Of course, we share the desire to raise the ambition for this country, and that's why we asked our own independent committee on climate change to advise us on how we should best reach a net zero target. We were the first industrialised country to actually ask for that advice, and I'm pleased also to welcome cross-party support for our bid to host the crucial United Nations climate change talks next year. But I do have to say, Mr. Speaker, that although the protests have been respectful and good-natured, they have caused disruption for many hundreds of thousands of hard-working Londoners, and they have required a heavy policing presence. And I do want to thank the police. I'd like to thank the police, I think we should all agree on that, for their professionalism and proportionate response, especially over a holiday weekend. Mr. Speaker, we know that we need to continue and accelerate the decarbonisation of our economy across all aspects of activity, and crucially help those other countries around the world, especially those who are not at the same stage of economic development as us. And this is going to require a broad-based, engaged, informed debate to deliver the low-carbon progress that we need, one that is fair, just and progressive and can be shared. I'm pleased to say, Mr. Speaker, that our progress to date has been supported by all political parties, and I do pay tribute to the Right Honourable Gentleman who has posed this question for his great leadership and continued support in this area. Our work has been supported by all political parties in the UK, and I hope we can continue to work together to drive the changes we must make to secure our future. Mr. Speaker, we have to secure the future of Planet A because there is no Planet B.
Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for her reply? Mr. Speaker, people can believe that the tactics of Extinction Rebellion are right or wrong, and the Minister obviously believes they're wrong. But the demonstrators are certainly not wrong about the failure of politics to do anything like what is necessary to fight climate change. They are right. The Minister said in her reply that we made progress as a country, and I thank her for what she said about me. But the truth is the planet is warming far faster than we are acting. Even the Paris commitments, the path-breaking Paris commitments, will take us way beyond the disaster of 2 degrees of warming, as the Minister knows. And the truth is, Mr. Speaker, climate change is not some theoretical future prospect, but is with us here and now. Wildfires, droughts, floods. And we have been warned by the scientists. It will get far worse if we do not act with much greater urgency. Now, in these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, it is no wonder people are disrupting the traffic and school children are striking. And the response from government cannot simply be to restore order and say it's doing a good job. The only credible answer of democratic politics in response to these protests is to admit that we need to raise our game and show we can act. So can I therefore ask the Minister today to commit to the following 4 actions as a down payment on what is necessary? First, will she seek to persuade the Prime Minister to declare a climate emergency, as many local authorities have done, to focus minds across government on the centrality of this issue to every department, not just hers? And, Mr. Speaker, goodness knows this is necessary, because we know from the figures that came out just before Easter that the government is woefully behind in meeting the 4th and 5th carbon budgets covering the next decade. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, she is to be commended for asking the Climate Change Committee to recommend a date when the UK will need to hit zero emissions, which they will do next week. But these recommendations cannot be allowed to be buried in Whitehall. So will she now commit to respond formally to them before the summer recess? Only by Britain showing world leadership again quickly can we hope to persuade other countries to act. Third, will she commit to working on the delivery of a British Green New Deal at scale, which could have the effect of giving work to hundreds of thousands of people across our country, for example, retrofitting buildings, and showing beyond doubt that economic justice and climate justice go together? Fourth and finally, will she take up the idea of Extinction Rebellion and others to involve the public in these discussions about both the threat of climate change and the action necessary, and yes, the trade-offs with a process of citizen deliberation? Because the truth is that for too long, and this covers both parties, people have been shut out of the climate debate and made to feel powerless, and this must change. Mr. Speaker, let me say this finally. Greta Thunberg, who is with us today in the public gallery, said this: "I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if our house is on fire, because it is." Mr. Speaker, she is right. If we do not act, people will say in the future, you knew the facts, but you did not care enough. We will be known as the generations with the knowledge of what was to come, but without the will or imagination to prevent it. We will be condemned, and rightly so. The right response to rebellion on our streets is to produce a revolution in climate leadership, and the time for action is now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you can see from the right honourable gentleman's remark the passion with which he has brought to this portfolio for many years, and which I share. I do want to correct him. I don't disagree with the protests. I disagree with some of the methods, certainly not the message. And as I've said to the honourable gentleman before, I think he and I would have been out there carrying the placards ourselves just a few years previously. I do also want to pick him up on the challenge points that he makes. He's right to acknowledge that we were bold in asking for advice on a net zero economy. We're the first industrialised economy to do so. I will consider that advice carefully and proportionately, crucially work out how we are going to pay for it. He will know from his time in my office, in my seat, that the Committee on Climate Change was unable to recommend a net zero target when we previously asked for that advice, because they didn't believe that it could be done cost effectively, or indeed that we had the technology to do so. And it's right that we give that work the focus that it requires. He's absolutely right to say that this needs to be a whole of government approach. I was really pleased weeks, Mr. Speaker, we had the Chancellor standing up and making the first ever green financial statement, bringing forward some extremely ambitious programmes to ensure that there will be no new homes built in this country reliant on fossil fuel heating from 2025. He asked me about declaring a climate emergency. The thing is, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what that would entail. I could stand here and say, I believe there is a climate emergency. He could say that. Many of our local councils have done so, including my own council of Wiltshire. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And that is why, Mr. Speaker, one of the things we should be proud of is the fact that we have, I think, the most detailed proposals for how we will hit our carbon budgets, and I'll answer his point on carbon budgets in a moment. He needs to look at, which I'm sure he has, what other governments have done. It's the easiest thing in the world for a politician to stand up and say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to set these targets, knowing that I will be dead and buried before those targets have to be met. The responsible thing to do is to set legislation in place, as he did, to bind every successive minister that comes along to meet those budgets or explain why, and to hold every future government's feet to the fire, and it is a fire in many cases, as he says, in terms of how we actually deliver our ambition. And the final point I wanted to make is he raised the point about carbon budgets. He will know that we are not woefully off. We are at 95 and 93% of where we need to be to meet budgets that end in 7 and 12 years' time. Well, and that is without even costing, for example, or calculating the challenges that we have had, the carbon savings we will have from the homes changes we've made. This is an ongoing process and one that we are absolutely, completely committed to deliver. I take his point about citizens' assemblies. The wonderful thing, Mr. Speaker, is that everybody can talk about this. This is now a national conversation that is happening. We have to engage with citizens, with businesses, with politicians, with local authorities, with bill payers, with taxpayers, with everybody, because there is not one single thing that will move this dial. We have to change everything. We have to do it rapidly, and we have to do it in a way that no future government can wiggle out of those responsibilities.
Sir John Redwood.
It's most important in this area that everything is based on the best possible science. I'm sure we'd all agree about that. So in the forecasts, what is the government's view on likely changes in water vapour levels and cloud cover and solar levels of radiation? Because these are also important matters.
He's right, and as a newly appointed Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, I just have to get that in there, he will know that we have some of the best climate modelling in the world. And the problem we have, Mr. Speaker, is that the planet is an unbelievably complicated ecosystem, and what we are finding is that feedback loops that what we didn't even realise, like what happens to the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica, could have a meaningful impact on our sea levels immediately. So we have, I believe, the best scientific evidence base we have ever had. The 1.5 degrees IPCC report was based on the best peer-reviewed science the world has ever seen. We have the message from our scientists. Now we must continue to act.
Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, the Right Honourable Lady or the Right Honourable Gentleman?
Be me, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, many congratulations to the Right Honourable Lady. Well, if she doesn't blow it, it may well be nobody else will blow the trumpet. And it's perfectly right. We offer her the warmest congratulations on that new acknowledgement. Indeed. Mr. Barry Gardiner.
I commend my right honourable friend for his timely question. The right to protest is one of the foundations of our freedom. From the Chartists to the suffragettes, the civil rights movement to anti-apartheid, all of those victories were won by citizens uniting against injustice, making their voice heard. And Extinction Rebellion and the school climate strikers are doing just that. And I too thank the police for the way in which they have policed the demonstrations on the whole with good humour. I was delighted to meet the demonstrators at Marble Arch yesterday, and I thank them for speaking the truth. Many of us listened to Greta Thunberg earlier today. She spoke about truth. The truth that we're in the midst of an ecological and climate emergency. And she also spoke about our refusal, our fear to acknowledge the truth that stopping this catastrophe requires a complete rethink in the way that we run our economy, so that GDP growth is no longer the touchstone. We are on track for catastrophic levels of global warming. Yet in the UK, we pride ourselves on the 40% reductions in emissions we say we've achieved below 1990 levels, whilst achieving a 72% increase in GDP. But the truth is out there. School children are teaching it to us. Those figures do not include aviation or shipping emissions. They do not include our imports or exports, and they've largely come from the Clean Power Directive in the European Union, which forced us to announce an end to coal-fired power stations. That's why thousands of our school children are on climate strike. They know that we are not acting with the speed and the seriousness that the climate emergency demands. So I ask the Minister, will she listen to the voice of Extinction Rebellion and of our own children? I echo the call from my right honourable friend. Will she join my party in declaring a national environmental and climate emergency and commit to bringing forward the government's response to the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations to achieve net zero urgently when they are published shortly? Will she do more to engage with the public in tackling the climate crisis? Because it's clear that our citizens need to be in the driving seat for a sustainable future. And will she work with Treasury colleagues and the Bank of England to address what Mark Carney has identified as climate-related financial risks and make the emissions curve and natural capital the key elements of our future economic viability? Because we know that however disruptive the climate demonstrations may have been in this past few weeks to businesses, they pale into insignificance against the capacity of climate disasters to wipe out human prosperity and human life itself.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, I just want to pick up on a couple of factual points. First of all, I do entirely share the honourable gentleman's commitment to the right to protest. It is a wonderful, wonderful freedom that we have, and one that we should use judiciously, and I know he and I both have. I do want to pick up on this point about coal. It is not the case that other countries across the EU are phasing out coal. In fact, when I was at the climate change talks in Bonn, it was shocking to see the barges of dirty Ruhr coal floating down the Rhine because Germany took an ideological decision to phase out nuclear power. For an island that is built on coal and surrounded by fish, that had 40% of its energy generation coming from coal when I was elected in 2010, to get to zero now, and it will be zero completely by 2025, is a huge achievement, and that has not been done by the Climate Directive. That has been done by unilateral policy decisions taken by the coalition government and continued by my government. And that is how we will continue to lead the world, by taking tough decisions, hopefully with cross-party support, to make the differences that we need. But then we can accelerate around the world, because, Mr. Speaker, our leadership on coal has enabled me and my counterpart in Canada to set up the Global Powering Past Coal Alliance, an alliance of 80-plus countries, cities, companies who have all committed to phase out coal thanks to the UK's leadership. I also wanted to reassure him. He makes a brilliant point about natural capital accounting, which will be formal government policy by 2020. And I would like to join him in paying tribute, I think, to the work of the Bank of England and the Governor Mark Carney, who have identified the challenge for investors and companies, and indeed for regulators, if there is not proper accounting for climate risk disclosure. Again, an area where we have continued to innovate and lead the world. So I'm delighted to share many of the points that the honourable gentleman makes, but I do believe fundamentally that a market-based economy that delivers rapidly reducing costs of technology and innovation, the sorts of innovation that has seen the price of offshore wind tumble over the last 2 years, is the way to go. And as I said, I will look with great interest at the advice we get from the Committee on Climate Change and act as soon as proportionate and possible.
Mr. Richard Benyon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not just the protesters on the streets or the children who come to our offices who are raising this. This is an issue that's being talked of around kitchen tables and amongst families who we represent. And the worst way to reflect those concerns, whoever they are, would be for opposition parties to say the government aren't doing enough, for us just to say, look at all the things we're doing. And I absolutely concur with her very cross-party consensus on this. And would she agree with me that one of the things to be applauded in this country is that we are not like the United States, where this is a polarised political issue. This is something that we, as a parliament, working together, can actually move the dial. She's made some really good points, as has the opposition. And does she agree with me? This is something where we really can reflect the needs and the wishes of people out there by the consensual nature of our debate.
And I would like to very much thank my right honourable friend for his work, particularly on waterways and rivers as a former minister. Again, this is not simply about air or biosphere, it's about the whole planet, all of the ecosystems working together, and he made an incredible amount of progress in that portfolio. And of course, he's right. When people look at us and they see us filling this place with hot air over the 3-year forward look about our relationship with the European Union, and then they see this place, this is the fullest I have ever seen it, Mr. Speaker, in my time as a minister, when we have been debating these portfolios. Well, there have been very few people on benches opposite previously as well, but they are right to look at us and say, what are you going to be doing cross-party working together, and also what role can organisations like the Youth Parliament play going forward? Are there organisations and assemblies already, including young people, that can help us take this progress forward?
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the fact the Extinction Rebellion protests have largely been peaceful and non-violent in nature, and that so many of those were young concerned activists, including Greta Thunberg from Sweden, but also Holly Gillibrand, who I met today, who's led climate action protests in the hometown of Fort William in Scotland. And I'd like to welcome both of them here today. Along with other young activists, they have travelled here to meet with leaders of the opposition parties to discuss how to respond to climate change. Given the Prime Minister is yet to meet with them, will the Prime Minister take time this week to discuss the vital issue with these young activists? After all, Mr. Speaker, it's our collective responsibility, and the UK Government must show leadership. Mr. Speaker, Scotland continues to outperform the UK and is world leading in its low-carbon transition, with figures showing emissions in Scotland down 49% as opposed to 38% for the UK as a whole since 1990. Will the Minister join me in welcoming these figures in Scotland, and will she commit to increasing faster and deeper efforts from our own government to help the UK figures come in line with Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the good news is that all of the devolved administrations and the Westminster Government have worked incredibly hard on this. It's a joint project. We calculate on a joint account. Of course, the taxpayers' subsidy that has gone into so much of the energy generation systems that have helped Scotland with its transition have come from UK taxpayers and UK tax policy. I can't speak for my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister's diary, but I am always delighted, as is my right honourable friend, the Minister for the Environment, to meet groups of people. As I say, we worked really hard today to try and get our diaries to mesh with those groups coming up, and offered various meetings, all of which were apparently not available. But it's a total pleasure. I mean, and I'm sure, like so many members in the House, I only have to go home and have my own children telling me what more we need to do, and saying should they go on protest. And I say, wouldn't it just be easier to tell Mum over a cup of tea what it is you want? But anyway, it's more fun to protest. But genuinely, we have to listen and we have to move, and we will continue to do so.
Rebecca Powell.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It's a testament to my constituents, whether they're young, old, of no religion or any religion, of whatever shape or size. They've come to me about the environment. This is an overridingly important issue for everybody, and sustainability should be at the heart of every department in government. And cross-party should be the name of the game on this. But if we can do one really positive thing, Mr. Speaker, to reverse climate change, it will be to reduce our emissions to net zero and fast. And I take my hat off to the Minister for going to the Climate Change Committee and asking advice on how we could possibly address this more quickly than our targets, because their advice was that we couldn't do it by 2050. I'm hopeful they'll change their mind. So could she please update us on that? And please could she also say when aviation and shipping might be included, as I feel they need to be.
To answer in reverse order, there has been progress made on aviation and shipping, and that again continues to be an international challenge because flights and ships leave and take off from different places, and but there is work accelerating on that, and indeed some investment going into low carbon fuels, which could be hugely important. I will happily update the House when we have received the net zero report and talk about the various aspects in that. I also just did want to flag that we are investing in the first net zero industrial cluster in the UK with 170 million of funding from the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. And as the Honourable Lady has reminded me, it is not just the young who are protesting. One of the most effective and wide-scale campaigning organisations in the UK in this area is the Women's Institute, which has over 9,000 climate ambassadors. This is a problem that affects all of us, and it is a solution that will involve all of us going forward.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank Greta Thunberg and the climate strikers and Extinction Rebellion for showing, frankly, more climate leadership on the streets than we often see inside this chamber. The Minister says that she doesn't know what a climate emergency looks like. Can I start by saying that it looks like doing what is scientifically necessary, not just what is deemed to be politically possible at the time? And in that spirit, in the meeting this morning that unfortunately the Prime Minister couldn't clear her diary to make, but all of the other opposition leaders did, we agreed to a number of proposals going forward, including things like ongoing dialogue with the UK climate strikers and stress testing all new manifesto commitments to make sure that they do not exceed the 1.5 degrees warming. Will her government sign up to those as a practical proposal?
I don't want to politicise diaries, Mr. Speaker, because of course invitations were also issued. The Honourable Lady is well aware that were not able to be accepted. So we're not going to go into that sort of political tit for tat, Mr. Speaker, that takes us down a rabbit hole of conflict that this situation does not need. Also on the point, the Honourable Lady I've debated with many times, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady frequently for her passion and commitment and leadership of her party. But just once, she could stand up and acknowledge the fact that the country she is proud to represent has led the world. She's shaking her head. She cannot even acknowledge that the UK has led the world in this particular area. And if we cannot acknowledge our leadership and celebrate that, how can we possibly hope to persuade other countries that emit far more carbon than us, of a far greater land area, that they should be making the changes that they also need to make?
Hugh Merriman.
Speaker, whilst I've got no time for those that deny climate change, I've also got little time for those that deny that great progress has been made. If it's the case that we have 40% of our renewables in electricity, which is up from 6% in 2010, isn't it important that we actually listen and work with our scientists and innovators that are going to improve this picture, rather than just listening to those that lie down on the streets?
Jon Jones is absolutely right. I think the debate here, Mr. Speaker, is about consumption emissions, and I won't take the House through the technicalities, but essentially there is an argument made that we have exported much of our our heavy energy creating activities. It is also the case, if people peruse the Bayes numbers, that our consumption emissions are also down 20% since, I believe, 1997. I'll check those facts before the next statement. But again, the whole world's economic systems are changing, and that is why the leadership that we display will help other countries to whom much of this activity has been transferred also to make the changes, in particular to have a low-carbon electricity system, which is often the greatest cause of emissions in those countries.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister put her finger on it when she said this is going to be about some tough decisions. She also expressed concern about expressing it being a climate emergency, because what she really wanted to do was move the dial. In Ireland, they have been able to move the dial not by leaving the public out on the streets, but by bringing them into an actual citizens' assembly, a proper citizens' assembly that hears the views of everyone, not just the activists but everyone, that has supported carbon taxes, an end to subsidies to peat extraction, and means that Ireland is now the first country to divest from fossil fuel. Will she meet with me and others who are supportive of the idea of a citizens' assembly to talk about whether that is the cross-party, cross-country way forward that we can actually tackle this climate emergency?
It's an absolute pleasure, of course, and I will point out to the lady that we already have carbon taxes. We introduced carbon taxes, a unilateral tax on emissions, which is what has driven us off coal, which again, the Honourable Lady doesn't seem to realise what an achievement that is. When she and I were elected, 40% of our electricity system was coal-based. So of course I will meet with her, but let's look at what has worked and see how we do more of that.
Luke Graham.
very much, Mr. Speaker. Will my honourable friend join me in welcoming the 2017 PwC report that shows the United Kingdom is the fastest decarbonising nation of the G7 nations? And can she also tell the House how the government is supporting new technologies such as the use of hydrogen in the Keele University experiment to heat domestic homes? And of course, what further steps can be taken to promote geothermal energy in Clackmannanshire?
I welcome my honourable friend's mention of an independent report that shows that we have decarbonised as a proportion of our economic growth faster than any other country, not just in the G7 but in the G20, and that we continue to accelerate our carbon reductions. And he's right to focus on heating. Heating is a major problem for a centralised gas-based heating economy like ours. The innovation that is happening in Keele, in Leeds and other areas to see how we might safely introduce hydrogen into the heating system. Of course, we then have to produce hydrogen in a low carbon emissions form, an opportunity to use excess renewable energy, particularly offshore wind. But this is an incredibly innovative time. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, if we can help the world migrate to hydrogen boilers and generate those and make those in the UK, we can export those as well and create competitive advantage as part of this transition.
Hilary Benn. Very much. Mr. Speaker, when we look at the climate science, I don't suppose there's a single member of this House who doesn't ask themselves how can we make the changes that are needed. And on the issue that she just raised, in November, she'll be aware, the Committee on Climate Change said that emissions from homes are off track and said that we would need to replace gas with hydrogen boilers and supplementary electric heating. Given that about 80% of homes depend on gas for heating or cooking, how is this change going to happen?
To emphasise homes, although homes are only 15% of our CO2 emissions, in fact the biggest nut we have to crack is industry and industrial emissions, which are much harder to do arguably. But I think the answer on homes is there will be no one-size-fits-all policy. There will be some decarbonisation of gas, some introduction of pure hydrogen, a move to electrification, a use of community heating, if you like, heat networks. There will be no one-size-fits-all. But what is happening, Mr. Speaker, is we have some amazingly innovative local authorities, Nottingham and Leeds spring to mind, who are actually trying to design these new forms of heating system into their own local economies and into their local home building programmes. And that is how we will innovate and drive the cost down. And if I may, Mr. Speaker, part of the announcement of no new fossil fuel heating in new homes from 2025 will also, I think, kick-start a revolution, particularly in reducing the cost of alternatives like heat pumps.
Steve Brine.
Thank you. The protests of last week, Mr. Speaker, if I'm honest, didn't greatly inconvenience my constituents, but so many of them, like me, share the grave emissions situation that we face. Now, I have to be honest and say I don't think panicking ever helped any situation, but would the excellent Minister agree that if we are going to do our bit on these small, let's face it, these small islands, one thing we've got to face up to is the poor energy efficiency of our existing, not our new, but our existing homes. And it's going to require a new Green Deal, and the gentleman asking the urgent question was that. And she can call it Green Deal, she can call it whatever she likes, but it is going to require some kind of new retrofit Green Deal if we're going to move the dial, as seems to be the expression of the afternoon, and lower those emissions.
Well, I can't disagree with the honourable gentleman that this focus on retrofitting is hugely important. I think he and I were on the Green Deal Bill Committee originally. We put ourselves on it because we believed there was a way to actually incentivise, to give people an incentive. Because, of course, if you retrofit your home, your energy bills go down. You often get a higher sale price or a lower running cost. We have to work on all sectors. There will continue to be an element of government investment. We're working with the mortgage lenders. There is evidence that actually offering a green mortgage pays for itself. You can actually borrow for more cheaply and then get back a better rate of return. And there has to be many, many ways of doing this. But ultimately, also in constituencies like mine, many homes are not suitable for traditional retrofit technologies like cavity wall insulation. And that's why part of the £2.6 billion of innovation we're spending over this Parliament has to go into finding solutions for those sorts of homes.
Sir Vincent Cable.
The Minister's right that there are some sectors like power generation where major progress has been made in carbon reduction. But would she agree that there are others like aviation where virtually nothing is taking place? So would she agree that the government should re-examine major expansion projects like Heathrow specifically to look at the climate change implications?
honourable gentleman tempts me into another department's area. I have to say, I believe most of the emissions problems around this specific aviation project relate to transport to and from the airport, and clearly there is much more that can be done with transport on that. But equally, we have to look at how we try and solve the aviation problem globally. Again, there is no point trying to do something unilaterally that disadvantages the UK economy when we could be working to solve the problem. One of the things the department's been doing is investing in alternative fuels, in many cases created from the waste products of other processes, and that's the sort of innovation that we need to see, because unless we can drop the emissions from aviation substantially, we will not be on track.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The science is clear that we need to stop pumping more emissions into the climate. So can I thank the Minister for spending time with the Science and Technology Select Committee today and answering very detailed questions on the government's policy. Does she agree with the 4 other experts from that committee that the UK has led the world in investment in innovative technology such as carbon capture and storage? And does she agree with myself and many colleagues that the UK should continue to lead the world in investment in innovative technologies to help find solutions to this situation?
Lady for raising carbon capture and storage. Members in the House will know that there was a competition run several years ago that was a rather crude, if you like, point-to-point competition. In one case, just decarbonising a coal plant that effectively will no longer be generating power. What we're now doing is trying to work out how carbon capture, usage and storage are embedded in an industrial cluster so that you can actually decarbonise heavy industry and create a way of sequestering that carbon alongside clean power generation. This is how I think, Mr. Speaker, we will solve the problems, not looking in economic silos, but trying to solve these problems on a whole of economy basis.
Julian McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The global food system accounts for 30% of emissions, and it said that without any action, food and farming will take up the whole of the Paris carbon emissions budget if we don't do anything about it. So why isn't anyone talking about it? I've been sitting here listening to this. I've been sat here listening to so many of these debates, and I could count on the fingers of one hand the number of parliamentarians that are ever prepared to ask what you're going to do about the global food system.
Tribute to the Honourable Lady, who has been walking the vegan walk now for many years and has been a doughty campaigner, and she's absolutely right. And CO2 emissions from land use and from farming will continue to rise precipitously unless we have changes both in the way that we treat soil, and she will know about the UK's plans for improving carbon sequestration in soil, and also how we farm. Unfortunately, the challenge is also how you feed the world cost effectively, and we need to continue to look at technological solutions for that. But she's right to focus on this. I find this and the industrial emissions bit are the parts that people very rarely talk about, so I thank her for raising this issue.
Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is right to raise the effect that this government has had on emissions, particularly from the power sector. But I'm sure she will remember that during the Labour leadership campaign of 2015, the member for Islington North said that he wanted to reopen the coal mines. Now, he then went on to win the leadership. It was a very popular policy. A couple of months later, he then clarified that he only wanted to reopen one coal mine in South Wales. Could the Minister update the House on to how the leader of the opposition's campaign to reopen the coal mines is going?
I wasn't at the Durham Miners Gala where those pledges were made, but I do think, with the exception of some of the members on the benches opposite, there is general cross-party support for phasing out coal as a power generation source, which is the dirtiest form of fossil fuel. Unfortunately, the honourable gentleman opposite, who leads his party, also, I believe, is against nuclear power. So that leaves an awfully big hole in the thermal generation part of the energy system going forward. But also, I just want to pay tribute to the honourable gentleman. He will know from his own constituency of Selby that some of these transitions can be difficult, involving job losses, and this is why this is such a challenge for other countries, and why the transition we have to make has to be just and fair and ensure that people's jobs are maintained and new jobs are created.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister asked what would be the point of declaring a climate change emergency. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's because it is an emergency. It's an emergency right now. It's an emergency across the world. Glaciers are melting. Seas are rising across the world, and the honourable member knows this, the Minister knows this. So I just don't understand, and I don't think the people watching will understand. I don't think my constituents in Bristol West understand what's stopping her from declaring a climate change emergency and then treating the problem as an emergency.
So let me try and help the Honourable Lady and her constituents. I don't see the point of saying anything unless we have actions to solve the problem. We have a massive growing problem with our global emissions. We have a massive problem which we're now realising affecting the balance of our economy. We are leading the world in this country in trying to solve this problem, and I accept that we need to go further and faster, but I want to focus on actions rather than standing here and saying, I've said a few things, job done. Let's focus on actions, not words.
Redwood Lee.
Exactly. So having instituted the fastest decarbonisation of any G20 country, will the Minister remind the House what is our total of global emissions, I think at 1%, compared to, say, that of China? We all know what would happen to an Extinction Rebellion demonstration in Tiananmen Square. So if we want to make a real difference about this, what practical steps are we doing internationally to encourage China, the USA and India to take real action?
The honourable gentleman's right to point out we're only 3% of the world's land area and rank 17th in terms of carbon emissions, but if he'll forgive me, it's a little bit of a false choice because much of our growth and prosperity has been caused by putting the CO2 up there in the first place, and I think it's very unfair to say to countries they can't enjoy a future growth rate unless they're prepared to very much cut their standard of living. So the point is we have to work together. I have to actually pay tribute to what many of the actions in China and in India, where some of the most rapid investments in electric vehicles and renewable energy are happening, and that is the reason that solar panel prices have dropped over 80% in the UK, meaning that we no longer need to subsidise them because of the investment that other countries are making. But he's right to point out we must work together. A CO2 molecule doesn't care where it's emitted from or where it's going. We all are contributing to the problem, and we must contribute to the solution.
Howie Wilson.
Speaker, many of those businesses, citizens and workers who have had their lives disrupted over the last week as a result of protesters, some of whom flew thousands of miles in CO2-emitting aeroplanes to cause roadblocks, which led to more CO2 emissions, and then arrogantly threatened to disrupt the Easter holidays of many hard-working families, will be amazed at some of the attitudes in this House today. Could the Minister tell us why were police actions which have been used against disruptive protests in London on previous occasions not used on this occasion? Was it because of government direction, the Mayor of London, or the police taking a decision themselves?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes a strong point, and I think I do want to pay tribute to the Met Police. I think under their commissioner they did respond. He will have seen the response today. I think there was a little bit of nervousness at the beginning of the process, unfortunately led by the Mayor of London, who didn't recognise that actually millions of people's lives would be disrupted. Well, hang on a sec, people are moaning and whinging. What's the point of stopping people using electric public transport and having to take cars? That seems utterly counterintuitive. So I think where we ended up was a proportionate response, but I do again want to pay tribute to the police, who I think have acted in a very good-humoured way and actually made sure that these protests were confined.
Winkler.
Reducing greenhouse gas is absolutely imperative, and natural gas replacing coal has vastly reduced greenhouse gases. Does the Minister agree we should back a responsible UK oil and gas sector and not offshore our climate change responsibility?
I do, and he will know, as many of his colleagues on this side of the House know, that the incredible contribution of the oil and gas sector to the Scottish economy cannot be overstated, but also that we are able to decarbonise gas very effectively, and frankly we produce it with far higher environmental standards than those other countries from whom we import.
Dennis Skinner.
After all this that she's had to say today, why is the government still in favour of fracking?
are entirely linked, Mr. Speaker, that we are a highly gas-dependent economy, as we know. We have a choice as to, we want to obviously cut the amount of gas that we use, but it's a good transitional fuel. He always does this, always shouts over me, it's very rude. And what we want to do is explore soberly and scientifically whether there are opportunities to extract gas onshore in a way that helps us with our energy security, something he used to care about when he was mining the black stuff all those years ago, and actually continue to see if we can generate jobs as a result of this. And I continue to say, Mr. Speaker, why is it that we trust the science so much on climate change, but when it comes to the science saying that shale gas extraction is safe, we refuse to listen?
Environment is important to all of us in the Kettering constituency, which is one of the most greenest boroughs in the whole of the country, with 30 very large wind turbines generating almost as much electricity as consumed by all the residential houses. However, I am concerned that whilst of course we must allow people to protest, and this is a very important issue, I do object on behalf of many thousands of my constituents to encouraging school children to go on strike. Whilst it's important for school children to have strong views on topical issues, why can't they protest at the weekend? Because education is very important.
It's a serious point. It's a very serious point. I mean, Ms. Thunberg's efforts, which have become a global phenomenon, I think demonstrate the power of a young person actually deciding to make these statements. But what I would say to protesting school children is this: we need the climate engineers, the geophysicists, the scientists of the future. Those are skills that you will learn best by engaging in education. And you're protesting, we're listening, we have to work together, and we need your skills to solve this problem.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, sir.
Was the home of the Industrial Revolution. We sparked the carbon revolution. We'd like to lead the zero carbon revolution. But it's harder to decarbonise our power system since the government phased out feed-in tariffs for solar. It's harder to decarbonise our transport system because of the confusion around electric vehicles identified by the Select Committee before Christmas. It's harder to decarbonise energy in our homes when the Minister can't tell me in parliamentary answers our share of the eco-funding that might fund that retrofitting. Cities in this country would like to lead the green industrial revolution. Why doesn't she help them?
I will certainly look at the last point. It may be that we just don't cut the data by metropolitan area, and I will look at that point, because ECO is an important fund that we're using to focus entirely on fuel poverty and also to create more innovation. I don't think there's confusion. The feed-in tariff scheme, which he will know, given his time in the Treasury, was an extremely expensive scheme. We've spent almost £6 billion so far. It will cost us £30 billion over the future of the scheme. And essentially, we've, as I mentioned to my honourable friend, we've seen the price of the renewables technologies that was supporting tumble. So I think it's right to stop. We don't have to subsidise in order to drive take-up, but the smart export guarantee that I will be introducing soon will pay people for that generation and ensure that there is a demand-side aggregation created in the homes who are investing in this. And on transport, I think we've been very clear. We've got one of the most ambitious programmes of moving to zero-carbon new vehicle sales. Well, it is true. The Honourable Lady should look at what other countries are doing. And also, as he will know from his constituency, 1 in 5 of the electric vehicles sold in Europe is made in the UK. We don't just want to be leaders in how many are driving around on our roads. We want to be leaders in investing in that technology that the world is moving towards.
Nigel Huddleston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree that caring about climate change and the environment isn't a monopoly of the left? Far from it, as evidenced by the many actions of this government. But there is a political debate to be had, and does she agree that it is possible to reduce emissions and grow the economy, and that this is particularly important not only for the UK, but for many of the world's developing economies?
Yes. My honourable friend hits the nail on the head that there is too much fear and not enough hope around this. If we look at the UK, where the low-carbon economic sector is growing at 4 times faster than the mainstream economy, we have 400,000 people, bigger than the aerospace sector, employed in green jobs, and we can continue to see these global opportunities from investment. This is a massive opportunity. Not only are we saving the world's ecosystems, we're actually creating jobs for the future, and we know that 65% of those under 24 want what they call a green-collar job. They just don't know how many are out there.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mrs.
Speaker. One way we can decarbonise homes, of course, is by using geothermal energy, particularly in the former mining areas. The University of Durham has done a lot of research on this, and I wonder if the Minister would like to come to learn about the research they're doing now and consider how we can implement this.
Excellent. It would be a pleasure. And I have to say, we've had several debates on this issue of geothermal heat from old mine workings in particular. It seems only fitting that the blood, sweat and tears of those thousands of men who dug up the energy source of our first industrial revolution could somehow be reused by using hot water as another source of energy. It would be a pleasure to come and visit.
Clive Lewis.
I welcome the Minister's comments about listening to the science and acting on the science. And if that's the case, then the Committee for Climate Change has asked and questioned whether support for oil and gas may become incompatible with the government's long-term climate change objectives. So in the spirit of not disappearing down a rabbit hole of conflict, perhaps we can agree on both sides of the House whether there is a sustainable way of reducing fossil fuel extraction to move from maximum economic recovery to sustainable economic recovery.
I think it's a very important point, Mr. Speaker, and it is the case that the oil and gas industry, which employs hundreds of thousands of people, has contributed billions to our exchequer and is extremely important to communities north of the border, one of our most productive industries, is part of the transition. And the exciting thing is technologies like offshore wind, the sector deal for which I announced just recently, will be a brilliant transition industry, an industry for many of those employees to transition into. And in fact, our world leadership in working in very difficult offshore conditions in oil and gas exploration is perfect for offshore wind. So there is a natural transition. But of course, these are important industries who also recognise, I believe, the role they have to play in the transition.
Joanna Cherry.
Speaker, a young woman from Boroughmuir High School in my constituency wrote to me ahead of the school climate strikes, and she was calling for politicians to prioritise wind and tidal power over nuclear and fossil fuels. Now, the Scottish Government is trying to do this, but until such time as we become independent, we require the UK Government's assistance. So can she tell me this? When will the UK Government reverse its policy of prioritising new nuclear plants and putting the kibosh on tidal power in Scotland?
I have to... Well, I won't correct the Honourable Lady on too many things, but we have a mixed, diverse energy supply, one that is decarbonising very rapidly. We haven't put the kibosh on tidal. In fact, we actually invested the same amount as R&D funding in tidal as we did with any other technology. It's just that other renewables have outcompeted it much more rapidly. However, I was very pleased to meet with the Renewable Energy Council recently and cross-party support to see what more we could do to support that. And of course, with nuclear, I believe that nuclear has a part to play. It's part of our zero carbon future. We have a nuclear sector deal, and it's an incredibly highly productive industry for the United Kingdom.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, I welcome what the Minister had to say on our cleanest and greenest year for electricity yet, and also her approach to the Committee on Climate Change. But does she share some of my concerns about the goals of Extinction Rebellion? For this is an organisation which is pledged to take non-violent direct action, but whose co-founder was arrested on charges of criminal damage against a corporate headquarters. To what extent is the government also looking at how we can mitigate the potentially violent actions of this movement?
I mean, he's right to point out that if we should be able to have a civilised, important and strong debate about our aims. It is challenging, though, to see that there are acts of violence or acts of criminal damage. And also, I am aware, Mr. Speaker, that no political party or indeed campaigning organisation is endorsing one of the key asks of the Extinction Rebellion, which is a net zero emissions target by 2025. It's simply not something that is able to be delivered. But I think it's right to have that challenge. But we have to be able to take what we do in this country best, which is have civilised debate, and apply it to the most important issue of our time.
Thank you, Speaker. The Minister mentioned her international influence about reducing carbon emissions. The USA is one of the biggest CO2 polluters in the world. Can she ask the Prime Minister to use all her influence when President Trump comes to the UK to get the US to recommit to its obligations from the Paris Summit and to set up a climate emergency in the USA to tackle global warming?
Well, the honourable gentleman raises an important point, but I would say that despite the rhetoric, the US's decarbonisation record is very good. In fact, they cut their carbon intensity by 3.7% to the year ending in 2017, which is well ahead of the global average and indeed well ahead of the EU's average. And he'll know that it's not just federal actions, it's the actions of states and cities and companies, and the We're Still In coalition, who is hugely accelerating work on decarbonisation. Acts like, for example, the net zero targets of the state of California are delivering real change in the United States, and we should celebrate that.
Ms Saville-Roberts.
Well, I too had the honour of meeting Greta Thunberg at the Parliamentary Leaders' Roundtable discussions this morning, and I'd like to put on record my thanks to all those involved in the youth climate change activists and who have succeeded in putting climate change at the top of the agenda. Mr Speaker, climate change waits for no government. I travelled to London on the train with Heather Bolton from Gwynedd, and she was on her way to attend the Extinction Rebellion protests here in Westminster. We talked about Fairbourne on the Gwynedd coast, where the whole community has been warned to prepare to move out within 40 years. Climate change is more than a passing inconvenience to the people of Fairbourne. Will she accept my invitation to visit the community and see the economic, the social and the human cost of inaction?
Always delighted to visit installations in Wales. In fact, I went to the constituency of Bridgend with the Honourable Lady opposite, and we saw some amazing innovation work that is being led there, so it would be an absolute pleasure. But she's right to point out that this is not just some sort of challenge for a few. The Kármán layer, the level where the Earth's atmosphere merges into outer space, where all of our gases upon which life depends, is 60 miles deep. So it would drive, I would not even get halfway to her constituency if I was driving straight up before I tipped out of the atmospheric layer. That is why this is such an important opportunity, and we must work together.
Danielle Rowley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If you'd believe it, Mr Speaker, it wasn't in the too distant past that I was a young activist. And what I hated then, and what I know young people hate, is when politicians say, young people, the future is theirs, because the present is theirs, and this planet is theirs too. And one of the 4 demands of the climate strikers is extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. They're so passionate about this topic. Would the Minister agree giving them the vote so they can vote on it?
Oh, I didn't realise the demands had got that broad. Look, I think the Honourable Lady is right to focus on something really important, that it is the job of governments to steward what they have for a period of time and pass it on in a better state to the next generation. Whether that is the Earth's climate, whether it is the economy, that is actually what we exist to do. And whether the argument about voting age sits in that, I don't know. I think we've heard loud and clear what the next generation, and indeed grannies, grandpas, parents, all of us need to do, and we need to work together to accelerate our actions.
Vera Hobhouse.
Speaker, our young people in many countries across the world, and I actually congratulate them because, let's face it, we wouldn't be sitting here today. They have reminded us how urgent the climate crisis is, and that we have to be very ambitious, a lot more ambitious than we have been so far. Is the government committed to make our electricity grid 100% carbon zero before 2050? And if so, when will we know about this new target?
Well, when I launched the offshore wind sector deal, I said that we will be at least at 70% net zero carbon for power generation by 2030, so in only 11 years' time. And so we can extrapolate further on that. But if you talk to energy system modelers, there is a view that there will always need to be some level of thermal energy generation on the grid, because you can't do a cold start based on current renewable and storage technology. And then that raises the question about how we decarbonise particularly our gas supply further.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's complacency in government why young people have left their classrooms to educate
politicians and to challenge us here in this place. So rather than just warm words, in the light that we are going to miss our 4th and 5th carbon budgets, will the Minister commit to setting every public authority and every local authority stringent carbon budgets?
The Honourable Lady is right to point out the role of local authorities in this. I happen to believe that so much policy is best made by it being pulled through at a local level, because you can join up your generation, your transport systems, your cycling and walking strategies rather than pushing it out from Westminster. But the young people of today, I mean, it's such a patronising phrase, isn't it? Everybody in the UK today should be proud of the fact that we listened, and 10 years ago, with cross-party support, we passed the world's first Climate Change Act. So we listen in this place. We might not act as quickly or in the ways that people want us to, but we have to look at our early movement and the fact that we have led the world in decarbonisation. We are listening and we are acting.
Jonathan Reynolds. Speaker, to deal with the climate emergency requires that we ensure billions and billions of pounds is invested in low-carbon technologies, which will mainly come from the private sector and has to go into particularly heat and to transport. And that money is there, but for it to be invested at scale requires certainty. And I'd just say to the Minister, since 2010, we've had zero-carbon homes, needlessly scrapped by the Coalition. Now it's coming back. The Eco Solid Wall Insulation Programme was announced. It lasted less than a year. Tidal lagoons have been flirted with and have gone nowhere. The carbon capture fund money was put up and then taken away. Onshore wind was banned entirely. The Green Investment Bank was set up. It's already been sold off. And that is fundamentally, Minister, why green investment in the UK is falling. Yes. And where there has been certainty, which is mainly in offshore wind, progress has indeed been rapid. But, Minister, isn't it the reality that it's not just the protesters, it's the financial markets too, who are saying there's been some good progress, but it's just not enough? And maybe it's time to listen to one or both of those groups.
I have to say, I mean, many of the things he talked about were being funded entirely by government subsidy, because government has no money of its own. It's tax, it's other people's money. So somebody has to pay. It's either taxpayers or consumers for whom many of the policy costs have been borne, or it has to be borne by the private sector, shareholders. But he's absolutely right that actually having certainty, having policies that will stand the test of political time, policies as we've set out now in the Clean Growth Strategy, are the way that we will get that investment certainty. And the good news is the world is moving very rapidly away from high carbon investments and looking for investment opportunities, and we are able to offer them.
Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We salute 16-year-old Greta Thunberg and the school climate strikers and Extinction Rebellion. They have shone a light on the issue of climate change in a way that it would seem only David Attenborough is able to equal. Surely the Minister recognises her government must do more. Perhaps they can follow the lead of the SNP Scottish Government with its world-leading climate change targets. And as my honourable friend across the benches has suggested, follow our example of allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to have a vote on these issues, because they quite clearly are well ahead of some of the dinosaurs in this place.
See, too many dinosaurs in the building today, Mr. Speaker. But look, again, I want to pay tribute, actually, because I think the devolved administrations and the Westminster Government have worked incredibly well on this issue. We share one goal. We share one set of climate budgets. We share one set largely of taxpayer receipts that have paid for much of this investment, and we must continue to work together, and we must look for points where we can come together rather than where we can diverge, as I'm afraid the Honourable Lady's party often wants to do.
Julie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Climate change is not a party political issue. It's an issue of global importance. And in that light, the government's complacency today and refusal to take leadership on this at a national level is extremely worrying. I'm feeling really emotional about this today. I listened to Greta earlier and applaud her for pointing out the obvious and for inspiring us and reminding us how very crucial it is that we take action now. And this morning, my granddaughter was born. And I look at her and I think that these children and these young people, we owe it to them to demonstrate, and as a government can I politely say, Minister, you wait to then to demonstrate that you are doing more than talking about this. Can you outline for us the actions that you will take to make sure that they do have the future that they deserve?
Congratulations to the Honourable Lady on becoming a granny. That doesn't seem possible. But she's absolutely right. I mean, but I want to say this, that whatever I say or ministers say from this dispatch box, frankly, is reported in Hansard and then is tomorrow's chip paper. What we have to do is act. We have to set out actions, set out our ambition and work together. And I'm disappointed to hear that she thinks I've been complacent at the dispatch box. I have tried incredibly hard to show that we are listening, we are acting, and we are delivering, and we have to accelerate that. But she should be very proud of the fact that we are the first developed country to say, help us understand what net zero looks like. What are those changes going to have to be? That sounds hopeless. That sounds hopeful to me.
Chris Bryant.
The vast majority of my constituents, despite living in an area of multiple deprivation, own their own homes. And those homes are ones that are very difficult to make viable and to conserve energy. The previous system that was brought in the coalition government was a complete and utter disaster. It meant that local businesses closed down. It meant lots of shoddy work was done. There were lots of families who were desperate because they thought that they'd wasted money and were financially out of pocket themselves. So will the government really look very closely at finding a new means of making sure that people like my constituents can do their bit, even though they haven't got a lot of money in their own personal pocket?
And I'm happy to tell the honourable gentleman that the Every Home Counts review that we did, whose recommendations we have accepted, where we have a trust mark for this work, should stop this problem happening in the future. Too much shoddy work has been done, reparations have been made, but essentially people have to have confidence that the work they're having done to their homes is done to a high standard and is effective.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tragically, Ella Kissa-Debre lost her life to asthma, and currently the courts are looking at whether the authorities had any responsibility in that tragic death, which I do believe is a crisis in children's respiratory health. There's a meeting tonight called Pollution Has No Borders, and one thing which the government could do would be to take away those cuts from local government, which was looking at more clean buses. Just increasing the number of bus journeys rather than car journeys would not only help lots of people on low incomes, but it would help the planet. Please, could that be one thing taken away from today's debate, which the Minister will pledge to look into giving that money back to councils so action can be taken on our terribly polluted air?
Well, the Honourable Lady is right to point out that one of the problems that we don't talk about enough is that CO2 pollution is often associated with particulate pollution, and one of the co-benefits of cutting emissions is that you get cleaner air. But I gently say I believe she's wrong to focus on a reduction in budgets in zero carbon transport. My recollection, and I will check this and write to her, is that those budgets have gone up. I myself have seen some of the hydrogen buses and hybrid buses that are running, and of course actually the challenge is also to get more cars off the road, which obviously have a far greater pollutant per mile travelled, and ensure that those children, particularly in the most deprived areas, have clean air to breathe.
Jo Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Extinction Rebellion is a vital movement, and joining the protest on Sunday with my 5-year-old son Andrew, we found an amazing sense of positivity, of peace and of passion for change. Young people are leading the way and we must listen to them. So does the Minister recognise that for all the action that is being taken on the current trajectory, it is not enough, and that what we need is a transformation in the level of our ambition if we are to secure our future?
I recognise ambitions need to be raised, not just here, but around the world. And that is why I hope that we will have the chance to secure the crucial climate change talks next year, because I think we need to demonstrate, as I said, that this is possible, that this is not something to be frightened of, and we need to work together with other countries to try and raise ambition collectively. And it will be wonderful to have cross-party support for the UK being the host of those talks.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, I think I could sum up the Minister's response today by saying that the rest of the world is rubbish, we're better, we're doing things ahead of everybody else, can't understand why people came here and demonstrated. There was by definition, it was a peaceful demonstration, but over 1,000 people managed to defy the authorities to the point where they were arrested. These people are not going to go away. So, Minister, what has changed as a result of their protests over the last few days?
I gently say to the honourable gentleman, I think that's a really wrong reading of what I have said, and I'm happy to send him Hansard. He'll find that quite the opposite has been said. What has changed is that we will... everything has changed in a way, in that we now know how broad this protest is. We now know the depths of people's feelings. We are as frustrated as they are, if you like, about some of the challenges. But we also have to recognise in this place that whatever we do is fair to his constituents, to my constituents, to those that pay for the change, and also means that the world can come with us. And I do want to keep emphasising that point, that we mustn't be complacent. Nobody is complacent, but we have shown that we can deliver, we will deliver, and we know we need to do more, but we will have to do that together.
Anna McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Extinction Rebellion protest over the last few days has prevented business as usual, but nothing compared to what climate change will do and is doing in certain areas of the world. It's not good enough to talk the talk and not walk the walk. This needs fundamental, transformative shift in our economy and in what we do. The Secretary of State is shutting her eyes and ears on this. So will she make a statement today and tell us what action is actually being taken across government to show this fundamental shift and challenge business as usual?
Thank the honourable lady for my inadvertent promotion, but I think she just has to look at the numbers. We've had the cleanest year for electricity generation we have ever had. This weekend we went the longest period for this country built on coal without using any coal. We're legislating to make sure that homes will have no more fossil fuel heatings. 42,000 homes in my constituency are off the gas grid. From 2025 you won't be able to build one in my constituency unless it has some form of pitching. I just think the honourable lady shakes her head. She knows better than many in this place, given her long level of involvement, that it's all very well politicians standing up and mouthing empty platitudes. What you have to deliver is have actions, not words, and that is what we are delivering.
Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As she knows, last week the Governor of the Bank of England warned that climate change poses a financial risk to investments such as people's pension savings. And in March, the $1 trillion Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund declared it will no longer invest in oil and gas exploration in order to minimise that exposure to those climate-related financial risks. So what steps will the Minister take to ensure that within the green finance strategy there are the incentives to ensure that people can both invest and organisations can provide investments that are sustainable?
To raise the issue of pension fund investing. In fact, when we had our Great Great Britain Week last year, one of the amazing things was one of the most effective things an individual can do is move their pension fund, if they're able to, or lobby their trustees, like the House of Common Pension Funds trustees, to move away from fossil fuel or unsustainable investment. The opportunities are there. I'm really proud of the work the Bank of England has done on the climate risk disclosure, and clearly we need to do more. But again, if the honourable lady has ideas, I'm extremely keen to discuss this, because we will be much better off if we all put our heads together.
Annalisa Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My city of Oxford is the first in the country to create a citizens' assembly focused on the climate crisis. The Minister said that she wanted a broad-based debate, but we all know what happens far too often. We have a knee-jerk, politically expedient reaction against anything that goes against the status quo. So please, will she come to Oxford, see what we're doing, and look genuinely at these cases where we can have a much more broad-based discussion about the climate crisis so we can do something about it?
Of course, and part of the reason that I am so passionate about this is I studied at that university many years ago. I studied climate change and geography and meteorology, and they have, the university and many of the people associated with it have been world leaders in understanding the science. And Oxford City Council has done some amazing things in this space. So again, we are really keen to learn. I don't accept this press any knee-jerk political action. There is a clean growth strategy that sets out what we will do over the next 25 years to meet our budgets. But if we've got good ideas, let's stop hoarding them and let's share them.
Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the sectors that has not done well in terms of reducing carbon emissions is, of course, road transport. And one of the policy levers that used to be available was the fuel duty escalator, which, of course, the coalition government ceased to proceed with, and the current government does not want to return to. Would the Minister agree with me that it needs to be looked at again? And would she accept that in terms of carbon emissions it's been a mistake?
Again, I mentioned at the beginning that you have to do things that are proportionate and fair. The honourable gentleman, I know, supported the cap on electricity prices, the fuel prices that we've put in, because we have to make sure that it is not the least well-off who are paying for this transition. But I would pay tribute to his work and his own personal cycling activities. The City of Cambridge, as he knows, is an exemplar for cycling and for effectively ensuring that road transport becomes very much a thing of the past.
Jim Shannon.
Can I first of all thank the Minister for her supporting the message and also for her actions as well. I was one of those other MPs who attended and listened to Greta Thunberg today, the 16-year-old, a very inspirational young girl, and certainly inspired me, inspired many others in this House as well. She's 16 years of age, Mr. Speaker. She's 6 years older than my oldest grandchild, Katie, 10 years older than my grandchild, Mia, and almost 16 years older than my grandchild, Austin. So what message would the Minister give my 3 grandchildren and all the other children that the climate action taken today will have made the difference?
That by working together, we can solve the biggest challenge humanity has ever faced. And it will be difficult, but it is doable. And in doing that, we will create jobs and prosperity for the next generation.
Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that over half of the UK's planned carbon reductions are tied up in some way or another to EU regulations, and EU agencies are key to enforcement. Assuming it is ever established, can the Minister tell us whether the Government's new Office for Environmental Protection will have a climate change and climate change enforcement remit, and if not, why not?
I think the honourable gentleman will be able to discuss that further during the passage of the bill. He makes a powerful point, but I would also reassure him, as we've said many times, that nothing as part of our EU exit will in any way compromise our climate ambition. Indeed, our ambition and our progress to date is well ahead of the rest of the EU.
Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I also extend my thanks and admiration to Greta Thunberg, whose speech I had the honour of hearing today. And yes, her microphone was working, which at some point was of concern to her. And clearly much does need to change. And as a country, we need to move forward together in order to deliver that change sustainably. So further to the question by my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, what substantial and specific plans does the Minister have for how we should formally engage with the public on how we respond in policy and legislative terms as a nation to our climate crisis? And why won't she consider a citizens' assembly?
In or out, I'm interested to see how this would work. I'm interested in how the Youth Parliament could provide a steer for younger people coming to this place. I'm also interested that she says, we haven't had a conversation. I was very struck when I launched the first ever Green Great Britain Week last October, that it was the first time we'd had a national moment where we actually came together right across the UK and talked about what we'd achieved and challenged ourselves to go further. There have been very many campaigns. The Show the Love campaign run by the Climate Coalition is brilliant. But I do think one of the exciting things, I was asked what is different, is that this conversation has stopped being niche and started being mainstream. And again, if the Honourable Lady thinks that citizens' assemblies are the way to go and we should be listening to them and getting a stronger steer, then let's have that conversation and see how it could work.
Melanie, on.
Will she overturn the ban on onshore wind?
On onshore wind, as the Honourable Lady well knows, I was elected on a manifesto that said that large-scale wind development, of which I believe there is now 13 gigawatts in the UK, rising to 14 over the next year, is not appropriate for very many parts of England. She will know from her constituency, though, the benefits that offshore wind can deliver, where we can put up 198 turbines, each as tall as the gherkin, with incredible opportunities for the offshore servicing fleet that we saw in her constituency to actually regenerate the whole of the coastal communities actually serving those developments. So we will continue to invest in onshore wind, but I do agree that I think large-scale onshore wind development is very inappropriate in many parts of England.
Aaron Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have today written to the Minister, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the House, alongside a growing list of now 71 of my colleagues from this side of the House, calling on the government to table at least a day's worth of debate in government time to discuss the government's response to the Climate Change Committee on how we meet our net zero carbon emissions sooner rather than later. Will the Minister commit to support that request today and to join us in that debate?
The usual channels work out that timetable, but the honourable gentleman will know I will talk about these issues all day, and in fact I'm due to make another statement in a short period of time, Mr. Speaker, so we can do all this again.
And more. And more. Plenty of scope. Alison Hewlett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister's keen to trumpet that the UK went 90 hours and 45 minutes without coal, but the reality is that her government's not making nearly enough of her potential in both on and offshore wind, solar, wave and hydro, particularly in pump storage hydro. And Scotland's efforts are being stymied by her government's policies. What specific measures will she bring in to incentivise renewables across the UK?
Well, we are already incentivising renewables. What we've always said, and I believe it's right, is that we have to be technologically neutral in these things. All of these technologies started out in pretty much the same place. Some have progressed faster than others. And also we have to have cost effectiveness. What we cannot do is spend other people's money supporting technology which will remain expensive over the long term. And the Honourable Lady's waving at me. Isn't it incredible that the price of offshore wind has dropped like a technology company over the last 2 years, not effectively a mechanical engineering industry, because of the policy structure and the auction structure and the market investment that we've brought forward? We should be celebrating that and celebrating the fact that the North Sea is the best place in the world for offshore wind.
Speaker, Global Witness published a report this morning which found $4.9 trillion invested in oil and gas fields either in development or not yet in production, which will therefore contribute to exceeding global warming scenarios of 1.5 degrees as per the terms of the Paris Accord. Now, much of that investment comes from FTSE 100 registered companies. So what legal advice will the government be giving to those London HQ'd businesses that are investing in breach of our international obligations?
The Honourable Lady, I'm sure, has also read a book called The Burning Question, published in 2013, that raised this challenge in terms of the valuation of reserves of oil and gas majors, and I indeed answered a question from her colleague earlier. There is a challenge around how quickly the oil and gas companies are being part of the transition, but as we were discussing earlier, so many people in the UK and indeed the Exchequer rely on this industry, and that's allowed us to cross-subsidise very much of the renewables success that we have delivered. But what she also knows is these companies are global organisations, and we do need to work globally to ensure that we solve that problem.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister's talked about actions, not words. She's also talked about the clean growth strategy. I wondered what she thought then of the plans to downgrade the electrification of rail lines and to invest and promote, as the Secretary of State for Transport has done, bimodal trains, which obviously part of the time are diesel.
I had a flashback to my old job as Rail Minister with the Honourable Lady, and of course she will know because her constituency is the beneficiary of some of the big investments that we're making, like the wind turbine factories that are located up there. I think the point on that is that we need to always balance cost, carbon and competitive advantage, and it was the case that we could deliver the benefits to passengers from those bimodal trains, who obviously have a much lower CO2 emission than if they were running in full diesel, and I'm sure her constituents welcome that investment.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Minister, the point of declaring a carbon emergency is to take action immediately, not 2025, 2030. So why aren't we changing the planning rules to mean that all homes have to be carbon neutral now? Why aren't we ensuring that all new buses on our streets are non-carbon emitting? These things are possible. 1,000 people have been arrested on the streets. My view is that they have done so to raise this issue in this House and in the country. Will she agree with me that that it is not in the public interest to prosecute those people. They should be getting awards, not prosecutions.
I thought there was a bit of mace waving coming on with that passionate speech. I will leave that question to the questions that happened earlier with my honourable friends from the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Sir Michael Fallon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to ask the Secretary of State for Transport whether he'll make a statement on his decision to delay yet again the award of the South